digital heritage and archaeology applications and experiences. Some of those discussions and some of those kind of musings are tied to what I'm going to say about ARCs. But some will be broader, based on my years of experience working in this space. I prepared a little bit of an introduction. I know Zach introduced me, so please apologize the slight repetitiveness. So as he says, and as my bio says, I'm associate professor in Department of Anthropology at MSU, where I teach archaeology, heritage studies, and digital stuff. Got to rep my archaeology chops. As an undergrad, I worked mostly in the Northern Plains, Saskatchewan, Alberta, a little bit in Manitoba. Worked in the US Midwest for a little bit, but spent all of my time in graduate school and after that working in Egypt. And here I am, a hell of a lot thinner and with a lot more hair at Nabta Playa, which is a really Neolithic site way out in the Western desert. I don't have an active field program anymore, and I likely won't for my career, as my work has been exclusively focused on applying digital methods and computational approaches within heritage and archaeology. I'm particularly focused on and interested in publicly engaged digital heritage, and if we frame publicly as sort of publics, broad, sort of in lots of different kinds of publics. I'm director of the Cultural Heritage Informatics Initiative, which is a fancy schmancy sounding thing that basically provides training and capacity building for graduate students interested in applying digital methods and computational approaches to heritage broadly construed. Director of the Digital Heritage Innovation and Imaging and Innovation Lab. It's a new lab. I've been around for about 2.5, 3 years now. And we're focused on mostly imaging-based sort of projects and mostly 3D stuff. But we also do digital archives and repositories and things like that. Until recently, I was director of the National Endowment for the Humanities funded Institute for Digital Archaeological Method and Practice. We brought together for several years, we brought together academic archaeologists, museum archaeologists, public archaeologists, private sector archaeologists, and sort of adjacent scholars and students to build critical skills and experiences building digital heritage applications, right? Very collaborative, very sort of co-working kinds of experiences. Right now, I got 2 big projects that I'm working on. Internment Archaeology Digital Archives. So the IDA is a project that I'm co-directing with my colleague Stacy Kemp in the Department of Anthropology. Stacy is a historical archaeologist. I am not. And the Internment Archaeology Digital Archive is basically to digitize and provide access to the material culture of Japanese Americans who were interned in the United States during the Second World War. It's funded by the U.S. National Parks Service. I'm also working on Core Collections. Core Collections is a sort of a next generation archaeological collections management platform for small to medium-sized institutions. Which sort of dovetails a little bit with another project that I've got going on, the Montpelier Digital Collections project. So Montpelier was it's a presidential plantation, and they're particularly interested in the enslaved population on the plantation. And we're digitizing all of their collections and building publicly engaged user experiences. Until very, very recently, I served as Associate Director of Matrix, which is the Center for Digital Humanities and Social Sciences at MSU. For 11 years, I did that. Recently, very recently stepped down from that role, but continue on as the head of archaeology and heritage projects at Matrix, right? So that situates me, right? A little bit of positionality there. What I think is important, what I work on, what I value, the kinds of things that I work on. So enough talking about me. Let's dive into the focus of this talk, ARCs. I want to start off with a problem statement. It's not particularly complicated and not particularly contested by any stretch of the imagination. But this question or this problem motivated ARCs, right? It was the fuel, so to speak, that really got us thinking about what this project could be and how it might serve the archaeological community. So as everybody knows, archaeology projects still, even those that are slowly moving to a paperless approach and a digital approach, archaeology generates a massive amount of paper records. Projects that have been going on for a very, very long time have an incredible overburden of legacy physical records. The problem, and here's the sort of problem statement, is those records largely go undigitized and are largely inaccessible. I mean, even those projects that digitize their records, they're digitizing it mostly for internal use. I mean, not always, but mostly for internal use. And there are things that never ever make it beyond the boundaries of the project itself. These records are the part of the publication process, right? They fuel the publication process, but they contain a massive amount of critical data and information that never make it to the publication process, right? And as such are sort of left out of a lot of archaeological interpretations, right? So we're talking field journals, talking hand-drawn illustrations, inventory cards, photographs, drawn profiles, drawn plans. This is particularly problematic. The fact that many of these records from projects largely go undigitized or inaccessible. This is particularly problematic because as the calls for collections-based, collections-based research are increasing exponentially in the face of the curatorial crisis. Many collections holding units they're desperate to get people to work within collections, but then nothing is digitized, right? These records and this information, these critical interpretations remain undigitized. So there's a disconnect between the need to do collections-based research because of the curatorial crisis in collections management and the ability to do that collections-based research, right? Because nothing is digitized. The primary original field records are not digitized at all. So here's the solution, or here's a solution, right? Here was our solution. Right? That was essentially what motivated the project. And how did we address it? Well, we addressed it with ARCs, right? ARCs was our answer to that crisis, the crisis of undigitized materials, the crisis of inaccessible legacy archaeological records, ARCs. ARCs is the archaeological cataloging or archaeological resource cataloging system. It is intended to be, and it is, a free open source web-based software solution that would allow archaeological projects, collections holding institutions, individual scholars to make these records, digitized records, more easy to manage, more easy to publish, more easy to share with the broader world, and not just to manage, publish, and share, but also to enhance, to ultimately fuel more interpretations, more work, sort of more exciting work that had previously not been able because the stuff was undigitized. The origins of the project rest with John Fry. John's a classical archaeologist at MSU. He's in the Department of Art History, and Design. He's now director of the excavations at Isthmia in Greece. It used to be Ohio State ran that project, but now it's moved over to MSU. Number of years ago, John got a very, very modest National Endowment for the Humanities Digital Startup Grant, so less than $40,000, which in this world is spectacularly modest. Basically to conceive of and to build a proof of concept for ARCs. He did that. Then he and I teamed up, and we sought and we received an NEH digital implementation grant, which is the pathway from the digital startup grant to the digital implementation grant, right? And the digital implementation grant is supposed to do what its name suggests: to take a concept, proof of concept, a prototype, and to fully implement it as a broadly accessible experience or piece of software. I have to acknowledge the National Endowment for the Humanities. They have been incredibly generous to my work and have probably funded around 75% of my work in the United States. And the program officers are incredibly amazing people who do so much hard work under so much pressure and so many constraints. So this is just my sort of acknowledgement of the NEH and the program officers themselves. All the development was done at Matrix, and that's where the project lives now. I didn't talk a lot about Matrix, but Matrix is a very long-running digital humanities center, lives in the College of Social Science. MSU is kind of weird in that when it comes to colleges or faculties, they're splitters instead of lumpers. So there are more colleges instead of less larger colleges. So we're in the College of Social Sciences, and then there's the College of Arts and Letters, which is the humanities college. And ironically, a digital humanities center is living in this College of Social Sciences, and mostly filled with social scientists. Matrix has been around for 25 years. It's one of the longest running extant digital humanities centers in North America. It's mostly focused on cultural heritage side of the DH equation. And lots of software development, digital repositories, archives. We are a building-oriented center. We've also been historically interested in working with African partners and in Africa, even though ARCs isn't an African project. Matrix has a permanent staff of like 9 people and a whole suite of programmers. We're actually the last unit on campus that was allowed to build its own server room. So we have really, really robust technical infrastructure. We've got a systems administrator that runs it. This is all to say that Matrix is very robust in terms of technical facilities, and all of the development for ARCs happened at Matrix. At the beginning of the project, before the implementation side of the project, before any technical development began, we gathered together a host of advisors, our advisory board, many of whom were both archaeological project directors themselves, or already eyeball deep in this digital world. So some of you may recognize this Seb Heath. Seb is, he's at the NYU Institute for Study of the Ancient World, and here he is pointing at something. Sarah Kansa, who ironically is pointing at something also. Eric is leads open context. To his right is Adam Rabinowitz. Adam is a classical archaeologist as well, but also sort of works very, very deeply in this digital world. He's the principal investigator of Periodo, which is a linked open data project for periodization at UT Austin. Here's, I'm not entirely sure I have this picture, but here's Adam talking about something really big. And Bill Carhart. Bill is a classical archaeologist as well. It's from UND. Looks like Adam's putting him to sleep. The result of this conversation, this two-day advisory board meeting, was myriad and incredibly important. I'm a great believer when it comes to digital projects to have true, honest contributions by an advisory board who are competent and who are appropriately chosen to make contributions that are meaningful, and as opposed to having just kind of a token advisory board, which a lot of projects unfortunately do. There's a lot of arguments that happened at that advisory board meeting. Okay, so let's skip forward a little bit. Let's talk about ARCs. Let's talk about what it does, how it functions, some of the choices we made. And again, this is just going to be sort of a walkthrough. I'm not going to do a live demo at all because you never tempt fate with a live demo during a talk, because invariably the thing that you're demoing will break or not work. However, I would really encourage folks to follow along. There's a couple links down at the bottom of the screen there. The second one, projects.arcs.msu.edu, is the matrix hosted version of ARCs, and you can go in and you can see all this stuff and you can putz around with it and play around with it. So as I'm jibber jabbering, I would really encourage you to sort of follow along, play along, but I'm just going to do sort of static screenshots because I don't want to tempt the gods. So at the beginning, ARCs was not intended to be a single archaeological project-focused platform. The idea was that it was an installation, software installation, that you could then use for multiple projects, as many projects as you wanted. And we envisioned museums using ARCs. We envisioned, labs using ARCs, right? That these projects might not necessarily be connected. They were only connected because they were part of the institution, and that ARCs would support all of those, or have a constellation of connected projects, archaeological projects, right? So it was intended to host a wide variety, any number of projects, right? A multi-project platform. Now, the core of ARCs, right, the legacy materials, digitized records, are referred generically as resources. So, resources are digitized field journals and digitized plans and profiles and all that kind of stuff. I think the thing that's important to note is that the project itself and the scholars themselves are responsible for digitizing the materials. There are some guides. We produce some guides and some best practices and some sort of workflow things for people to digitize stuff, but digitizing is the scholar's responsibility. So anyways, once they digitize stuff, they can then start uploading stuff and ingesting stuff into an ARCs installation, right? And every digital object is called a resource. It's very generically called a resource. All of the resources are keyword searchable, either across the entire installation, right? If you have an installation with like multiple sites on it and multiple projects, you can search across the entire installation, or you can search within projects themselves, right? So you can drill down into the silo of the project itself and just search there. Search results can be filtered, suite of variables, season, resource type, stuff like that. I mean, this is general, search, models. Beyond just sort of the raw digital the resources, right? The digital objects themselves. ARCs, one of the sort of the core features of ARCs is allowing people to build collections, right? The idea is that, you have this bucket of digital objects that all may not be meaningful to you, but if you're doing work on a certain site or a certain year, you could pull all the things on that year from that site and then organize them into collections, and then you could just work within that collection. So you see here, there are 4 collections visible, and you give them the name, whatever you want, right? It's not a complicated thing, building collections. The collections can be, and we're gonna circle back to this in a little bit. Collections can be open, completely open. They can be closed to everyone except those who are authenticated users. They also can be closed to everyone except for people with whom you share them, right? So there's a variety of access levels here. And when we circle back to talking about issues of access, we'll talk about what drove our conversations, which is going to be kind of important for some of the stuff that I'm going to end up with. Each of the digital objects, resources, has a record detail page. Again, not terribly complex. It allows people to sort of browse through multi-page documents if you want. And then it also, on the right side there, you see this sort of tiered metadata for the digital object that is, project, season, excavation, subject, right? So there are various tiers of metadata associated with all digital objects. And again, we're going to put that aside for a second and circle back to metadata, okay? Because metadata is awesome. Any digital object has, or resource, excuse me, I keep on saying digital objects, but all the resources allow authenticated users to have conversations. Right? So you can have a conversation around a threaded conversation around any single object. So here's me. This is a staged conversation. Here's me asking, does anyone have a Harris matrix for this? Not that I use Harris matrices. And then John responding to them and saying, no, we didn't, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, so you can have these conversations around objects. The owner of the object, the person who, or resource, person who uploaded it, actually gets a notification if there is a conversation around that object. So a project director actually, someone posts a question, a project director will get a notification, and then that can create a conversation around an object, a moment for some engagement around that particular object. And you can have multiple threaded discussions, right? It's not one single threaded discussion. You can create new discussions, and they just stack up, and they can be thematic or just ask a question and answer a question, whatever. The other really important part of ARCs, and one of the pillars, is the annotation tools. Now we're using the term annotation fairly broadly. So annotation includes transcription, annotation includes linking objects within an installation. So what you can do is you can see here someone is adding an annotation that is linking this object to another object, right? And it brings up this little window, and you can search for other resources and say, all right, I want to link this one to this one. So imagine, linking a profile of an excavation unit with a page in a field journal in which that excavation unit is mentioned. So you can create this connective tissue between various resources and kind of up the contextualization bit. And in many ways, right, it's thinking about this as a physical archive and finding aids and things connected to one another. To do any of the annotations, to do any of these more user sort of generated stuff, you have to be an authenticated user. Like a general public person can't actually do that, but creating an account's like a 5-second thing. Right, here's an example of an annotation that connects a resource to something external, so outside of ARCs, where the previous one was connecting to things within ARCs. So if you know someone, right, there's a specific record from the Archaeological Data Service, you know that there was a record that relates to that in some way. You can connect things to the outside there. The other thing is that all of the metadata is editable. It's editable, and of course, editing metadata requires, there are various levels of permissions, and so there's public, there's a user account, and then there's basically a scholar or an administrator account. You have to be the highest level account to actually directly edit the metadata. So basically you have full permissions to edit it and make changes and whatnot and save them. The good thing is that all metadata edits are reflected in a backend dashboard. So you can see here, what was the resource KID. KID is a numerical designation, a unique identifier. There's the word I'm looking for, a unique identifier for a resource. What the title is, who the editor is, what field name, what was the old value, what was the new value when they did it. And you can actually approve it or deny it or reject it or delete it, right? So the administrator, the super admin of the install or the project can actually have a little bit of control about the edits that are made. Okay, so back to sexy metadata. At this point, I need to mention ARCs. So ARCs core, I have to mention ARCs core. ARCs core was the metadata scheme that we developed for the project itself. And of course, you have to call a metadata scheme core or something core, right? Because of Dublin core, of course. But ARCs core was, there was a real need for it. There are archaeological metadata schemes. I mean, for those of you who are familiar, archaeological metadata is a complicated beast, but there is nothing at all purpose-built for legacy records. Yes, you could use Dublin core to be sure and sort of modify it a little bit, but there is no standardized metadata scheme that is particularly specific for archaeological records, and that's what ARCs core was. It was based on ArchaeoCore. ArchaeoCore was sort of an experimental metadata scheme that was created at UVA. It's released on GitHub. Anyone can use it, modify it, and it really sort of speaks to the philosophy of openness that we embraced. Okay, back to ARCs. If a user doesn't have high enough permissions to directly edit metadata, they can flag problematic metadata areas. So they can tell the administrator, hey, there's a problem with this, without actually editing it, because if they don't have permission to edit it. And all of that shows up in the backend dashboard, right? All of the flags, resolve them, unresolve them, delete them, right? So it's tools for the administrator. All user activity, so we've been talking about all the user activity, metadata edits, flags, annotations, all that kind of stuff. All that's tracked in the back end, user activity. So you can see, and it's a logged user activity, not user activity in the across the board. So anyone that has an account, right, it logs their activity, all of it, in the dashboard. And each user, all account holding users, have a profile page which publicly displays their edits, annotations, discussions, and any collections they might have created. So you can see there, that's mine, super out of date, but it'll show all of my collections and all that kind of stuff. Now, I talked a little bit about this, so we've hinted to issues of access and privacy a little bit, and one of the critical discussions about resources and collections that we had was about access, and specifically open access. Well, both John and I are quite copyleft. There are obvious instances in which material should be gated. We encountered some instances where people didn't want to publicly display collections because they're worried that the existence of the collection itself and the things in the collection might create a situation where they were like scooped, and you know, their work, which they would take to publication, someone would get there first by just looking at the collection. So we created a bunch of tiered collections resources. So here you see a collections page in which only public collections are visible, collections that don't require you to log in. Here you're looking at locked resources that require authentication and permission to view. And in the actual a user's dashboard, this is where you can actually set. You can see there, you know, here's one of my collections. I can set it as displayed publicly, login necessary, only selected users, only I can view it. And only selected users, if you choose that, then you can say this person, and that person can see it. Nobody else can see it. It was a compromise for a variety of reasons. Why? Well, there were issues of ownership. I own this thing. Intellectual protectionism. This can't be accessible or available because I'm still working on it. But I want it in ARCs for whatever reason. There were issues of privacy and embarrassing content. I didn't expect this, actually, that a lot of people wanted this sort of gated access because they were embarrassed in what was in field journals. But there's also some genuine reasons, right? You know, a lot of field journals are done by students, and there's, in the United States, there are FERPA issues, right? There are student privacy issues. So there needed to be a way of making some of that stuff private. But also, it's just like, people were embarrassed what they had put in their own field journals. Like, I mean, as we know, field journals are often, you know, one part sort of data collection and one part narrative, like Fred, that stupid bastard, he wouldn't get out of the sun today or something like that, right? You know, people were actually embarrassed about that stuff, and they didn't want it openly accessible. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how ARCS was built, right? Like technical architecture. It's a fairly straightforward, though complex, LAMP web application. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. It's a fairly standard stack for building web applications. However, the backbone of the project is Cora. Cora is Matrix's digital repository platform. It's open source. Link there to GitHub if you want it. It's been around for about 15 years and powers just about everything that Matrix does. It's our sort of large Cora installation, has millions of digital objects in it. It powers hundreds of sites, and that is the backbone of ARCS. So, right, the digital repository layer upon which the web application is built. Now, one of the key goals of the project was to produce two versions of ARCS, a Matrix-hosted version, which would act as an exemplar, but would also host the partner projects that I had mentioned earlier, those people who were at the advisory board meeting, and then a self-installable, self-hosted version, the idea being that anyone could install it anywhere, right, on their own system. Right, the Matrix hosted version is publicly accessible. Hope some of you are like playing with it right now. Built a promotional website, that was that arcs.matrix.msu.edu, that would provide potential users with information, right? This is what you do with public software. The self-hosted, self-installable version was released on GitHub. The link being right there. It is unfortunately far from perfect, and we'll circle back to this. This is part of, actually, it's part of this, part of the discussion. A lot went right with Matrix, or a lot went right with ARCS. I'm sort of deeply proud of the project. It fills a really important niche. It's a compelling and usable user experience. ARCS core is really important. but there was a lot that went wrong with the project. Now, some of a lot that went wrong with the project are going to dovetail with the broader discussions about digital heritage and archaeology software development that I'm going to sort of end my talk with. And some of them are unique to ARCs, right? For those of you who have experience building software and building digital experiences or working on digital heritage and archaeology project, a lot of this is going to be familiar. This stuff isn't unique to ARCs, and it's not unique to any digital project at all. So that's important to know. First really big issue, probably the biggest issue with ARCs, is that the project suffered significant delays because halfway through ARCs, maybe 40% of the way through ARCs, Matrix actually released a new version of Cora. So Cora, we had been, the initial versions of ARCs had been built on Cora 2, which had been around for a really, really long time and desperately needed to be rebuilt, which is a project that we launched into. And again, about halfway-ish through ARCs, Cora 3 dropped. And we had to make a really, really tough decision. Do we stick with the backbone, Cora 2, that we were building for, with the recognition that Cora 2 was never going to be updated again. Never going to be updated again. It's still a very functional piece of software. There's still some legacy projects out there that run on Cora 2, but it had been around for a long damn time and needed to be rebuilt. So do we leave it on Cora 2 and keep steaming along, knowing that it won't be updated, knowing that it's going to be an out-of-date piece of software, or do we switch gears and move ARCs over to Cora 3 and basically take on the problems that will come with that, with the recognition that this software was going to be maintained and this software was going to be updated. This is the current version of Cora, right? You know, and we get to take advantage of all of the new things in Cora 3. Like there was a whole new API model and all sorts of stuff. Cora 3 is a wonderful thing. Cora 2, you know, it's old software, not so much. So we made a very difficult decision, a decision that I still am, that still causes me a lot of stress today, because we basically had to rebuild ARCs from the ground up. And this was like year 1.5 of a 3-year grant. And we made that decision. And like I said, it's a very stressful decision. We would have hit all our milestones. We probably would have been able to do some of the things that we weren't able to do because we would have had time to do them if we had stuck with Cora 2, but then we would have had out-of-date software. Anyways, you see I'm like wrestling with it right now. So basically, ARCs needed to be completely refactored because it was Cora 3 was an entirely piece of new software. It wasn't an updated piece of Cora 2. It was entirely new software. So the project had to be completely refactored and also in most cases completely rebuilt. That blew our schedule. And it was, and not only that, the Cora 3, when Cora 3 dropped, like I said, 40% through the project, it was the beta version of Cora 3. So it was not it still had bugs in it that we were finding. And every time that something happened with Cora 3, it would impact ARCs. So basically what it did is it stretched the development way beyond when it should. We actually sought a cost and no cost extension for 1 extra year on the project, and the NEH only allows 1 no cost extension, and we continued development after it. and it's still missing things that it should have had. This had an incredible impact on us. And it was, in many ways, it was kind of a no-win situation, quite honestly. You know, what do you do? Which one of these? But it's something that definitely went wrong. And related to that was because our development schedule was completely destroyed because of this radical refactoring that we had to do and adopting Core 3 mid-project and the problems with that. We had to drop a whole bunch of really critical features. For instance, the project was originally supposed to have a easy install wizard, right? This idea that core or ARCs could be used by people who didn't have a lot of experience with software. And we envisioned a, WordPress's famous 5-minute install, right? Where it doesn't take a lot to install it. And, maybe a project director could do it. Maybe a student could do it, right? Out the window. It doesn't exist. There is an automated script to deploy on AWS, but that's it, right? No other things like Reclaim Cloud or DigitalOcean. You can install it by hand, and it functions, but it's a complicated process and somewhat opaque. We had to drop a lot of the linked open data features. ARCs was really supposed to have a bunch of linked open data features. They had to be tossed. And it originally was designed with a very robust data mapping tool for data ingestion. There is a data mapping tool, like here's your data and here's ARC's core and mapping the data on ingest. That still exists, but it needed to be a lot more robust. So we lost a lot of the features that were really important, and we lost features that would allow adoption by the broader community, and that was the point. The other sort of big failure is that the hosted version of ARCs, the projects.arcs.matrix.msu.edu, failed to onboard the original partners, right? All of those original projects were supposed to be part of that install. Now there's only one site there, it's piecemeal. And the reason why is that by the time we were there, we were like, well beyond. No one had any will or resources or time or effort and energy to actually onboard all of those projects. And because some of the ingestion tools were a little rougher than they should have been, it meant that onboarding new projects was a more complicated process. It was a perfectly doable process, but it wasn't as seamless as it should have been, which meant more time, more effort, more energy, and we had none of that. And the final sort of what went wrong is that, and this is a huge issue, the frustrations that many felt during the project soured any commitment that Matrix had to future versions of this project, and it kills me to this day. John and I had a really robust roadmap for ARCs, data collection in the field, that would just, you digitize it, it would go straight into ARCs, all sorts of really cool stuff. It's likely never going to happen because of all of the sort of friction and the stress and the frustration that happened as a result of some of these problems that I talked about. Most of that was put on hold, and it will likely never happen. And like I said, I'm deeply proud of this project. And while from the outside, people are like, works awesome, looks awesome, it's got great features, they fail to realize that it fell flat in some really, really critical ways. And quite honestly, that wasn't anyone's fault. It was mostly a result of serendipitous, unfortunate events and a few poor decisions along the way that got amplified and sort of rippled through the entire project. So where's it going? I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, it's a functional piece of software. It works fine. It's great. People can install it. It's open source, really liberal open source license. It's a new license, GNU license that's It's not parasitic, I believe. So it's quite generous, the open source license. So anyone can use it. Anyone can install it. But it was not as earth-shattering, domain-changing as we would like, and it's very likely it will never be, which again just kills me because I love this project. So I want to finish off the talk with some general thoughts about building software services, digital experiences for archaeology and heritage. As I said before, some of these things echoed some of the stuff that happened with ARCs, right? Some are more general, drawing upon my years of experience working in this space. The unfortunate thing is that, and mea culpa, I am so guilty of this. The unfortunate thing is that much of the digital heritage world, digital archaeology world, is still in the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come stage of things. They think that if they just build a wonderful thing, and then they throw it up on the internet, that's it, right? Throwing stuff up online isn't the end, it's the beginning. Just because you put something online doesn't necessarily your work is publicly engaged or useful or usable or important. I'd argue that access, making it accessible, putting it online, is the baseline for any kind of publicly engaged digital heritage and archaeology. And ARCS is a publicly engaged digital heritage and archaeology project. It's intended to serve the public, the scholarly public, yes, but it's intended to serve the public. It isn't a piece of software that was built by us for us. It is a publicly engaged project. So this idea that I'm just going to build this thing and it's awesome and everyone thinks it's awesome and then I'll just put it online is the way you present your materials and present your software and services to people is a huge mistake. And I file it under this, if you build it, they will come mentality, which some people will recognize, of course, from Field of Dreams. We also need to think in a far more sophisticated way about openness. I talk about openness to my students all the damn time, and we wrestle with it. What does openness mean, and what is the value of openness? What is the drawback of openness? The unfortunate thing is that people think of openness in a very binary way. They don't quite realize that openness within digital heritage and archaeology is a many-armed tentacular beast. It's not just binary, right? It's not just open or closed, right? This is the idea. You know, people, when people talk about open access or openness, they think it's either closed or open, right? Black or white, binary, open or closed. I would argue that, and this speaks to me saying that we need to think about openness in a far more sophisticated way, that openness exists along a spectrum, right? And this is, I mean, there are lots of people who agree with me, and I agree with lots of people, right? This isn't a particularly unique thing I'm saying, but it's a problem that I do see. Openness exists along a spectrum, and your spectrum should be informed by your unique situation, right? In contexts where we digitized material or data, or digitized material or data comes from Indigenous communities, where cultural sensitivity, sacredness, secretness is an issue, a paramount issue. You know, closed isn't a bad thing. Closed could be a deeply ethical thing. So openness exists along a spectrum, and building software and services and projects that embrace this idea of openness along a spectrum is particularly important. And it's something that we wrestled with and tried to implement in ARCs with these sort of various mechanisms to gate content or not gate content or provide access to content as well. I would also argue that in the long-term, realistic and practical sustainability is absolutely key to any digital heritage or archaeology project, and should absolutely be at the core of any project planning. It should be considered to be one of the initial project variables. Like you have to think about sustainability and preservation. And sustainability and preservation are two separate things, but they are intertwined, of course. And sustainability isn't just like about long-term digital preservation, but it's also about how the hell do you pay for this thing? You know, how do you update it? You know, that kind of stuff down the line when there's a new version of PHP. Sustainability and crafting a sustainable, long-term sustainable project should be one of the first conversations that you have, right? And it should be value-driven. You cannot have a conversation about sustainability that is not value driven. What are our values in this project, and how does sustainability dovetail with those values? Because ultimately, we all need to work to ensure that the future of digital archaeology and heritage is both open and ethical, useful and usable. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Well, thanks so much, Ethan. That was really informative, and just, you know, hearing, like, it's not every day that you get such a you know, reflective, non-promotional, solely promotional talk about these kinds of projects that take a lot of time and effort to, you know, put a lot of, you know, pour your soul into them, and then having to sort of acknowledge a lot of the issues that sort of potentially or, like, you know, a lot of failures or areas that could have been better. I'm wondering if I'm going to stop recording so that we could start the discussion.